When you think about Henry VIII's kids, you probably imagine Bloody Mary with her ruthless reputation. Or maybe Elizabeth I in all her glory. But there was another child, one whose short time as king would show a darkness that even his infamous father might have found disturbing. Edward VI became king when he was just 9 years old. This seemingly innocent boy would turn into one of England's most controlling rulers, and his death, it was so twisted it would haunt the Tudor family forever. This isn't just a story about a sick kid who died young. It's about how total power can corrupt anyone, even a child. What you're about to learn about Edward's final days will change everything you thought you knew about the Tudors. The year was 1537. Henry VIII finally got what he'd wanted so badly, a legitimate son. All of England celebrated Edward's birth. After decades of uncertainty about who would rule next, here was the answer. But this joy came with a terrible price. Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, died just 12 days after he was born. The baby prince had no mother. This made him even more precious to his father, who was becoming more and more paranoid. From day one, Edward wasn't treated like a normal child. He was England's future savior. Guards, tutors, and courtiers surrounded him constantly. They never let him forget his divine destiny. Being cut off from normal childhood experiences was the first step in creating a monster. His sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, had both felt their father's anger and rejection. But not Edward. He knew only praise and worship. Henry VIII might have felt guilty about how he'd treated his daughters. He showered his son with attention and affection that went way too far. The young prince got the best tutors money could buy. But these weren't regular teachers. They were extreme Protestant religious scholars, hand-picked to shape Edward into the perfect Protestant king. Starting at age 6, Edward wasn't just learning Latin and Greek. He was studying detailed religious texts about why Catholicism was evil. He learned that Protestant kings had the God-given right to rule with absolute power. The education Henry VIII set up for his son was more like brainwashing than learning. Edward's main tutor, John Check, was brilliant but also a religious fanatic. He filled the boy's head with dreams of England as a new Jerusalem, completely cleansed of Catholics. Every lesson Edward learned was poisoned. History, philosophy, how to rule. It all came wrapped in the same message. Protestants were superior, and kings answered to no one but God. By age 8, this child could argue complex religious points about why Catholics should die. He could explain why anyone who dared oppose him was basically opposing God himself. What made Edward's childhood so dangerous wasn't just what he learned. It was how alone he was while learning it. Sure, he could debate theology with university professors, but he'd never played with other kids, never had a normal friendship. The only people around him were adults who bowed and scraped, creating a boy who understood complicated political ideas but had zero understanding of how real people felt or why their lives mattered. This deadly mix, brilliant mind, dead heart, would shape everything about his reign. In the fall of 1547, England got a 9-year-old king. Edward VI took the throne after his father Henry VIII died, inheriting more than just a crown. He got a kingdom ripping itself apart over religion. The boy had been shaped by the most extreme Protestant teachers his father could find. These men had filled his head with dreams of religious purity and total power. His older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, knew what their father's anger felt like. Not Edward. He'd been protected, praised, told since birth that greatness was his destiny. Mix God-given authority with a spoiled child's temper, and you get a recipe for mass death. The England Edward inherited was ready to explode. His father had broken from Rome and created the Church of England, but the country was still split. Catholics, moderate Protestants, radical reformers, all at each other's throats. Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, seemed like it might govern reasonably. But the young king had other plans. From his very first council meetings, Edward showed a chilling mix of childish tantrums and ice-cold calculation. He'd interrupt seasoned advisors to lecture them about Protestant doctrine. What really shocked people who watched him was how fast this 9-year-old started throwing his weight around. Within weeks of being crowned, Edward was personally going through death sentences, and he seemed to enjoy it. This 9-year-old boy would review executions of people he thought were heretics with disturbing excitement. Court records from back then show something chilling. Here was a child who treated life and death like a school assignment. He'd debate why someone deserved to die using theology, the same way he might discuss Latin homework. People who were there said Edward would actually smile when signing death warrants. He seemed proud of himself for finding Bible verses to justify each killing. The boy king's first months were wild. Courtiers whispered about his religious tantrums, explosive meltdowns whenever anyone suggested going easy on Catholics. Edward had soaked up his tutor's lessons so completely that he truly believed any compromise with Catholic practices was betraying Jesus himself. Once, when an advisor suggested letting some Catholic nobles worship privately, Edward threw his inkwell at the man. He screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. People thought this was just childish behavior at first, but it wasn't. They were watching a dangerous religious fanatic being born. What really disturbed people was that Edward had no normal kid interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward spent his free time reading about the Spanish Inquisition. He took detailed notes on torture methods. His servants found drawings in his room showing different ways to torture people, complete with Edward's own notes about which ones worked best for getting confessions from heretics. This was a boy who should have been learning to ride horses. Instead, he was studying the most efficient ways to break people's bodies and spirits for his Protestant vision. The scariest part: Edward had both religious fanaticism and royal power. While his advisors schemed around him, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. He kept detailed journals of his reign. These documents reveal a child who loved reading about executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of people he called heretics. By age 10, Edward was writing sermons himself that were read in churches across England. Sermons calling for the complete elimination of the Catholic Church had a strong grip on things, and they promised God would punish anyone who dared show kindness to heretics. The young king's cruelty went far beyond religious matters. Edward had a mean streak that shocked even the toughest courtiers, men who'd served his brutal father for years. When servants messed up, Edward didn't just punish them. He humiliated them. One poor page spilled wine on the king's papers. What happened next? The 11-year-old king ordered him to stand in the courtyard for hours while people threw rotten food at him. Edward watched it all happen, clearly enjoying himself. He even took notes on how his victims reacted, like he was running some twisted experiment. The boy king kept a journal during this time. His entries reveal something chilling. a mind that was losing touch with normal human feelings. He wrote about people's suffering the same way he wrote about the weather. Pain and fear were just interesting things to observe, not tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being whipped on his orders, all because she supposedly said Catholic prayers, Edward only wrote one thing. He noted that the punishment worked better than expected at stopping her from making any more mistakes. How Edward treated his own family tells us everything we need to know about what he was becoming. He'd grown up with his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, but once he became king, no warmth, no affection, nothing. He saw them through one lens only: religion. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or gotten rid of. Elizabeth was slightly better because she was Protestant, making her a possible ally. For Edward, family meant nothing more than political chess pieces. Things got even darker when his uncle Thomas Seymour tried to win him over with gifts and sweet talk. Most kids would have loved the attention. Not Edward. He saw right through it. This was manipulation, plain and simple. When Thomas got arrested for treason, Edward didn't just support his execution. He watched from his window as the man who'd once shown him kindness was dragged to his death. People who saw it said, "The boy king's face showed nothing, not a flicker of emotion as the axe came down. He'd sit there writing in his journal, taking notes on which execution methods worked best." When Edward turned 12, something changed. The boy who used to be weak and bookish suddenly wanted to control everything. He'd override his advisors whenever he thought they were going soft. His Protestant reforms got brutal. Church attendance became mandatory. He set up networks of spies to watch everyone. Step out of line, you'd pay dearly. Edward personally created a surveillance system that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Kids got rewards for turning in their own parents. The king's need for control touched every part of religious life in England. Edward wrote detailed rules about everything: how to worship in public, how to pray at home, what to believe, even how to think about God. Break these rules, that was treason, against the crown and against God himself. The punishment started with public shame, moved to prison, and ended with death. The boy king reviewed every single case himself. He'd often make the punishments worse because he thought the original sentences were too soft. Edward built what was basically a thought police force. Report your neighbor's religious habits and get a reward. The young king loved reading these reports. He'd call in the accusers to get more dirt on their neighbor's supposed crimes. Get caught with Catholic sympathies, prison, torture, or death awaited you. Edward personally reviewed the punishments and usually made them harsher. His court became a place where paranoia paid off and showing mercy meant you were weak. The persecution machine Edward built was terrifyingly organized, and the king ran it himself. Other rulers might let their underlings handle the dirty work, but not Edward. He insisted on reviewing every case personally. He'd study every detail of the supposed crimes. Then he'd come up with specific punishments designed for each person's particular religious mistakes. The journals from back then, they read like instruction books for torturing people because of their beliefs. Page after page of discussions about which punishments worked best for different religious crimes. What made Edward's cruelty so terrifying was how he mixed a child's imagination with deadly serious plans. When the usual punishments weren't enough, this teenage king would dream up new ways to humiliate and hurt people. He'd always back it up with fancy religious reasoning. There was this Catholic priest who wouldn't give up his faith. Edward made him walk through London's streets carrying a sign that said, "Enemy of Christ." Kids threw rocks at him, all on Edward's orders. The king watched from his palace window. People say he laughed at the priest's pain while telling his secretary to write down what he saw. Edward's obsession with religious purity poisoned his own family relationships. It showed he had no natural love in his heart. He didn't see his half-sister Mary as family. She was a devoted Catholic, and to him, that made her the biggest threat to Protestant England. We still have private letters where Edward wrote about Mary. The hatred is both childish and terrifying. He called her the bastard and Christ's enemy. He spent time plotting how to declare her illegitimate. He even wanted her executed for heresy. This boy, who should have loved his sister instead, fantasized about watching her burn at the stake. Edward's hatred for Mary wasn't just politics. It consumed him personally, and even his most extreme advisors got worried. The young king would spend hours dreaming up ways to legally remove Mary from inheriting the throne. Protestant lawyers were happy to help find legal excuses for what was basically killing his own sister. People at court noticed Edward's mood would turn dark just hearing Mary's name. He'd storm off to his rooms to write long rants about why God demanded she be removed from the succession. The boy king's plans for Mary got more elaborate and cruel over time. Edward wrote out detailed plans for her arrest, trial, and execution. He listed specific charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote the confession he wanted to force her to sign, making her give up Catholicism and admit her born out of wedlock before getting the mercy of a quick beheading instead of being burned alive. These documents kept in the royal archives show a mind that had gone way beyond normal political rivalry. This was genuine, sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complicated, but just as disturbing. Sure, he liked that she was Protestant, but he saw his younger sister mainly as a useful tool for his religious plans, not as family. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's future marriage to strengthen Protestant alliances. Her happiness, irrelevant. All that mattered were the political advantages her marriage could bring to his cause. Even when he felt somewhat positive toward Elizabeth, it was all about his religious obsessions. His sister's value to him was purely practical. The king couldn't form normal family relationships, and this extended to his entire court. Edward treated his nobles, advisors, and servants like chess pieces. They weren't people with their own worth. They were just pieces to move around for his religious and political strategies. You could serve him faithfully for years and still get thrown away or even executed. All it took was not showing enough enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Being loyal to Edward meant total submission to his vision of Protestant England. There was no room for personal conscience, no room for moral doubts. When Edward started showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior got even more erratic and cruel. Facing death didn't soften him. The 15-year-old king became obsessed with making sure his Protestant reforms would outlive him. He knew Mary would bring back Catholicism when she took the throne. This knowledge drove him to desperate measures. The thought of his Catholic sister undoing his life's work filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness. He started thinking about solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. The young king's failing health seemed to make his extremism worse, not better. As Edward grew weaker in body, his religious fever burned brighter. It was like he was trying to cram a lifetime of Protestant purification into his final months. Court physicians said the king's illness came with periods of fevered preaching. He'd deliver these rambling sermons about the need he wanted to wipe out Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. People thought he was just raving from fever at first, but when Edward had clear moments, they realized something terrifying. He meant every word. The king started meeting with Protestant extremists in secret. They were plotting something huge. They wanted to skip over both Mary and Elizabeth and put his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne instead. The conspiracy they cooked up was shocking in how bold and cruel it was. They planned to arrest or kill both his sisters. Then they'd set up a puppet government run by Protestant fanatics. Even though he was physically weak, the 15-year-old king threw himself into these planning sessions. His energy amazed his co-conspirators. It also frightened them. Edward's final plot showed just how much he'd changed. He'd gone from an innocent child to someone who wanted to be a tyrant. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward put together a plan that would have killed both his sisters. They wanted to create a Protestant regime more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included mass executions of Catholic nobles. They'd seize all Catholic properties. They'd set up a permanent religious police force to monitor every single aspect of English life. Edward was deeply involved in planning these horrors, and he was enthusiastic about it. The dying king spent his final weeks making lists of Catholics to execute, properties to seize, laws to pass in his Protestant paradise. His handwriting got shakier and shakier from his illness, but he kept writing. Page after page of plans for what was basically religious genocide. The boy who once seemed like an innocent victim of political games turned out to be the mastermind. He was behind a conspiracy that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful. But Edward's illness had a cruel twist. It was almost like divine punishment for what he'd planned. Modern medical experts think the young king had tuberculosis combined with arsenic poisoning. His own doctors might have poisoned him by accident while trying to treat him. People at the time saw the irony. The king who'd poisoned England with religious hatred was being slowly poisoned by the very people trying to save him. As the poisons destroyed his body bit by bit, Edward's body was breaking down in terrifying ways. He saw things that weren't there and had periods where he lost his mind completely. His courtiers tried to spin these episodes as holy visions from God. The boy who'd shown no mercy to anyone else was now suffering horribly himself. Pain racked his body as he slowly wasted away. The court doctors noticed something strange. Instead of finding comfort in his faith, Edward's physical agony seemed to make his religious obsessions worse. It was like his suffering was feeding his madness rather than cleansing his soul. The way Edward died was absolutely horrifying to watch. Weeks before the end, his body started to smell terrible. His skin turned a sickly green color that made the physicians think he'd been poisoned. His hair fell out, his fingernails too. Violent seizures shook his body and left him unable to move for hours at a time. The boy who'd once been called the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children had become something grotesque. His own body seemed to be fighting against whatever was killing him. But here's the most disturbing part. Edward stayed aware through it all. He knew exactly what was happening to him. His final days were a nightmare of screaming in pain one moment, then ranting about Protestant martyrs the next. When he could speak clearly, he didn't talk about making peace or forgiving anyone. No, he talked about how upset he was that he wouldn't live long enough to finish purifying England. The dying king actually begged the conspirators around him to keep going with their plot after he was gone. He promised them God would reward them for creating his Protestant paradise. Edward's deathbed scene was a twisted mockery of how a king should die. Instead of asking for forgiveness or telling his family he loved them, Edward used his last breaths to curse his Catholic sister Mary. He prayed for God to save Protestant England from what he called her wickedness. The witnesses said his final words weren't about peace. They were full of hate. A fitting end for someone whose entire life had been consumed by religious extremism and political fanaticism. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, you could feel the relief in the room, though nobody dared say it out loud. The boy king who was supposed to save England had become its nightmare instead. His death was the only thing that stopped his increasingly extreme policies from pushing the kingdom into civil war. Even his most loyal supporters secretly knew that Edward's death might have been a blessing for England, though they'd never dare say it out loud. The moment Edward died, everything fell apart. His grand schemes had depended entirely on his personal power. Without the king pushing it forward, the whole conspiracy crumbled in just days. Moderate Protestants jumped ship fast. They finally saw the plot for what it was: extremist madness. Lady Jane Grey, who was supposed to benefit from Edward's coup, suddenly found herself completely alone. Nobles who'd sworn loyalty to the Protestant cause mysteriously had urgent business elsewhere. Mary claimed the throne successfully, and here's the shocking part. Both Catholics and moderate Protestants supported her. They were horrified by what Edward's reign had shown them about religious extremism. The boy king had dreamed of being England's greatest Protestant champion. Instead, people mainly remembered his cruelty and felt relief when he died. Even devoted Protestants welcomed Catholic Mary. They preferred her to more Protestant extremists. The irony runs deep. Edward was obsessed with destroying Catholic influence, but his extremism actually made it stronger. He'd persecuted moderate Protestant voices so harshly that English Protestantism became dominated by fanatics. These extremists repelled ordinary believers instead of winning them over. By the time Edward died, many English Protestants saw Catholicism as an escape. They wanted refuge from the harsh demands of Edward's twisted version of Reformed religion. Modern historians are taking a fresh look at Edward II's reign, and what they're finding is deeply disturbing. It's far darker than the old story of a sick boy manipulated by power-hungry advisors. Court records and private letters paint a different picture. They show a young man who genuinely enjoyed persecution and seemed to take pleasure in others' suffering. Edward personally planned executions. He kept detailed journals documenting torture methods. The evidence suggests that for 6 years, England was ruled by what we can only call a child psychopath with unlimited power. Edward's transformation from innocent child to cruel tyrant is deeply unsettling. Power corrupts everyone, but imagine what it does to a child who's never heard the word no. Adult rulers might keep some shred of empathy or at least think about politics before they act. Not Edward. This boy lived completely cut off from normal people and truly believed God had chosen him to rule. It was the perfect recipe for cruelty. Here was a kid who thought anyone disagreeing with him was literally sinning against God. He became capable of horrors that shocked people even in those brutal Tudor times. The courtiers around young Edward were terrified of him. But what could they do? The same divine right that gave him power also meant opposing him was like opposing God himself. Even his closest advisors couldn't stop his extreme policies. The boy king had built a system where his every wish became law, and his growing appetite for cruelty had nothing to stop it except death itself. The most chilling part? Think about what would have happened if Edward had grown up. He had big plans for Protestant England. He wanted a permanent religious police force. He planned to wipe out every Catholic noble. He dreamed of a surveillance state that would watch every single thing his subjects did in private. This teenager had already started putting these policies in place before he died in 1553. If Edward VI had reached adulthood, he might have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. Edward's legacy reminds us that evil can come from the most unexpected places. Good intentions can turn monstrous when mixed with unlimited power and religious extremism. This boy king thought he was saving England's soul, but he nearly destroyed the country itself. His death might have been the greatest mercy his reign could have given his people. His story warns us about what happens when you combine total authority with absolute certainty that you're right, especially when you give that power to someone too young to understand what they're really doing. Edward shows us how dangerous it is when youth, power, and ideology collide. Adult tyrants might hold back because of politics or personal relationships. But Edward, his complete isolation and unshakable belief that he was righteous made him capable of planning atrocities that even the most hardened politicians found. It's shocking. This child should have been playing with toys. Instead, he was planning mass executions and religious purges. He treated human lives like they were nothing, just things to use up in his quest for religious purity. The boy king's reign shows us something disturbing about education. When it lacks balance and human perspective, it becomes indoctrination. Edward's tutors had created a brilliant theological scholar, but they'd also created a moral monster. Here was someone who could come up with elaborate intellectual reasons for cruelty, but he'd never learned basic human empathy. His story warns us about the dangers of any educational system that puts ideological purity above human decency. In the end, Edward VI's brief reign stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of how power corrupts innocence. The boy who began as Henry VIII's cherished heir ended up so frightening that his own subjects celebrated when he died. His transformation from protected child to would-be tyrant reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. It shows the particular dangers of those who believe their cruelty serves a higher purpose. The death of Edward VI marked more than just the end of a life. It marked the end of what might have been England's darkest possible future. The boy king's final agony, racked with pain and consumed with hatred for his own family, was a fitting end to a reign that had promised so much hope but delivered only fear. By dying young, Edward VI may have inadvertently done his greatest service to the England he claimed to love. He spared it from seeing his terrible vision come to full flower,